The ancient Egyptian civilization lasted for over 3,000 years and became one of the most powerful and iconic civilizations in history.
In a locked storeroom in Turin sits a 3,000-year-old papyrus. It lists rulers who governed Egypt for over 13,000 years before the first pharaoh ever lived. No tomb, no city, no name survives. 4 ancient sources, spanning 2,500 years, all point to the same vanished rulers. Where did they go? The papyrus. The Turin Museum holds one of the largest collections of Egyptian artifacts outside of Egypt itself. Most of what it contains is well catalogued, well lit, and available to researchers who know where to look. But in the storage areas behind the public galleries, there are items that have not been on display for decades. Objects whose significance has been understood for a long time, without that understanding producing any satisfying resolution. One of those objects is a papyrus known as the Turin King List. It sits in a climate-controlled environment, fragmented across dozens of pieces that have been painstakingly assembled over 2 centuries of scholarship. The damage it sustained during its modern history, mishandled during transport in the early 19th century, stored improperly before its significance was fully understood, means that large sections of what it once contained are gone. What remains is enough to establish what kind of document it was and what it claimed. The format is bureaucratic. The Turin King List is not a religious text or a monument inscription. It is administrative in character, a compiled record of rulers in the style that Egyptian scribes used for tracking dynasties, tribute records, and official histories. It was produced under Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE, which places it in a period when Egyptian record-keeping was highly developed, and the scribes doing the compiling were working from older sources that are no longer available to us. The list begins where any reader familiar with Egyptian history would expect it to begin, with the gods. A sequence of divine rulers is listed, with reign lengths attached. These reign lengths run into the tens of thousands of years. Modern scholarship has treated this section as mythology, the Egyptian theological framework for understanding the origins of legitimate kingship, projected backward in time as a legitimizing narrative for the historical dynasties that followed. Then comes a category that is harder to dismiss as pure mythology. Between the gods and the historical pharaohs, the Turin King List records a group of rulers called the Shemsu Hor. The translation of the name is not disputed among Egyptologists. It means the followers of Horus, or sometimes the companions of Horus. The list assigns them a collective reign of approximately 13,420 years. They are listed in the same bureaucratic format as the historical kings whose records the scribes could verify. They are treated as a real category, not as a symbolic one. 4 ancient sources across 2,500 years of Egyptian history record this same category of rulers. Understanding what those sources are, and what each of them says independently, is where the real question begins. The Turin King List. The Turin Papyrus was compiled under Ramesses II, one of the longest ruling and most thoroughly documented pharaohs in Egyptian history. The scribes working during his reign were compiling and preserving official records on a significant scale, and the King List was part of that project. What makes the list significant is not just what it contains, but what it reveals about its sources. The scribes who produced it were not inventing the categories they used. They were copying from older records, now lost, that established the framework the list follows. The structure of the document, gods, then Shemsu Hor, then historical pharaohs, was not something the 13th century BCE scribes created. They received it from whatever archives they were working from and preserved it in the format their training specified. The reign lengths assigned to the Shemsu Hor category are the detail that has produced the most sustained scholarly attention. A collective reign of more than 13,000 years, recorded in an administrative document by scribes who were meticulous enough about historical accuracy that we still use their king list today to cross-reference and verify archaeological chronology for the dynastic period. Egyptian scribes were not careless with numbers. The Turin King List is valuable to modern scholarship precisely because its numerical records for the historical dynasties have proven reliable when checked against independent evidence. The same scribes who produced that reliable numerical record also produced the Shamsu-Hor entry with its specific reign length. Two possibilities exist. The scribes were copying an older tradition that they did not fully understand and that they preserved out of convention rather than conviction. Or, the older tradition they were copying contained genuine historical memory of something that predated the dynasties we have physical evidence for. What the Turin King List cannot do, on its own, is resolve which possibility is correct. But it does not stand alone. A second source, roughly 1,000 years older, records the same category. The Palermo Stone. The Palermo Stone is a fragment of black basalt that was discovered in the 19th century and is dated to the 5th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, placing it roughly 5,000 years ago. It is approximately 1,000 years older than the Turin King List, produced in a completely different period of Egyptian history, by scribes operating under different rulers with different political priorities. The Palermo Stone records annals. It is a year-by-year account of significant events during the reigns of early Egyptian kings, and it is one of the oldest historical documents of any kind in the world. Its format is different from the Turin King List. Its purpose was different. It was produced for a different audience. And yet it records the same convention. The Palermo Stone opens with a sequence of pre-dynastic rulers, semi-divine figures who governed before the historical kings. The names and the framing differ in their details from the Turin King List, but the structural claim is the same. Before the historical pharaohs, there was another category of ruler, and that category was being recorded as history rather than as pure mythology. The significance of this corroboration is not that it proves the Shamsu-Hor were real in the sense that the historical pharaohs were real. It proves that the claim about them was old, older than the Turin King List, old enough that the scribes of the 5th dynasty, working from their own sources, were preserving the same basic framework. Two sources, separated by 1,000 years, using different formats and serving different purposes, pointing at the same pre-dynastic category. A third source goes back further still and says even less, which in some respects says more. The pyramid texts. The Pyramid of Unas stands at Saqqara, south of Cairo. Unas was the last ruler of the 5th dynasty, and his pyramid is modest in its external dimensions compared to the Great Pyramids at Giza. Inside the burial chamber, the walls are covered with texts. These are the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writing on earth. They were carved into the walls of the pyramid approximately 4,300 years ago, but the traditions they encode are understood to be significantly older than the carving itself. The pyramid texts contain references to the Shamsu-Hor. The references are brief, and they carry no explanation. The name appears in the context of establishing the legitimacy and continuity of royal authority, used as a reference point that the reader is apparently expected to already understand. The scribes who carved these texts into the burial chamber walls did not define who the Shamsu-Hor were or explain their significance. They used the category as though any reader would know what it referred to. That assumption of familiarity is itself significant. In a text this old, in a document this important, a category that is referenced without explanation is a category that was already established. The tradition of the pre-dynastic divine rulers was not new when these walls were carved. It was old enough that it required no introduction. The pyramid texts are the earliest Egyptian religious writing we have, and they mention the Shamsu-Hor as an already known fact of Egyptian sacred history. That means the tradition predates even this text, pushing its origins back into a period for which we have no surviving written record at all. A fourth source, much later in date but claiming to draw on far older archives, adds the most specific detail of any of the four. The Edfu texts. On the west bank of the Nile in Upper Egypt, the Temple of Horus at Edfu is one of the best preserved ancient temples in the country. It was built during the Ptolemaic period, in the centuries following Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt, when Greek rulers were governing the country and Egyptian religious traditions were being actively maintained and documented. The carvings on the walls of Edfu cover an enormous range of material, but among the most studied are the sections known as the Edfu building texts. These texts claim something specific about their own origins. They present themselves not as Ptolemaic-era compositions, but as copies of far older documents, temple archives, the texts assert, that recorded the original knowledge upon which Egyptian religious and architectural traditions were founded. The claim cannot be independently verified. We cannot cross-reference the alleged source archives because they no longer exist, if they ever existed in the form the Edfu texts describe. What the Edfu building texts contain, regardless of the question of their ultimate source, is a narrative. It describes a group of divine beings who lived in a homeland to the west of Egypt. Their world was destroyed by a catastrophe. The texts describe it in terms of darkness, water, and the sudden end of a settled existence. The survivors migrated. They brought with them knowledge of architecture, sacred geometry, and the principles upon which temples should be built and oriented. They eventually reached Egypt and transmitted this knowledge to the people they found there. The French Egyptologist Émile Chassina spent 40 years documenting and translating the Edfu texts in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His work produced the standard scholarly reference for these inscriptions, and its thoroughness established the Edfu building texts as a serious subject of Egyptological research rather than a fringe curiosity. The narrative they contain is real. The question of what the narrative refers to is what remains open. The Shem-Suhor appear in the Edfu framework as the group whose knowledge was transmitted and whose tradition Egyptian civilization claims as its foundation. 4 sources, 4 genres, 4 different periods of Egyptian history pointing at the same pre-dynastic category of rulers with the same consistent claim, the Green Sahara. Understanding where the Shem-Suhor narrative might have come from requires understanding what the landscape of northeastern Africa looked like in the period before Egyptian civilization emerged. The Sahara Desert, today the largest hot desert on Earth, was not always what it is now. Between approximately 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, a period geologists call the African Humid Period, the Sahara was dramatically different. Monsoon patterns that no longer reach the region brought regular rainfall to areas that are now barren sand. The evidence for this is extensive and comes from multiple independent scientific disciplines. Satellite imagery reveals the dried channels of ancient rivers beneath the desert surface. Fossilized pollen from lake sediments shows the presence of plant communities consistent with well-watered grassland environments. Cave paintings in the central Sahara depict hippos, crocodiles, elephants, and cattle in areas where nothing of the kind could survive today. People lived in this landscape. Archaeological evidence of human settlement across the Saharan region during the African Humid Period is substantial. These were not small, scattered groups moving through marginal terrain. They were communities organized enough to paint detailed murals on rock faces and to maintain cattle herds over extended periods. Then the rains stopped. The transition from the Green Sahara to the desert that exists today happened gradually, over centuries, but from the perspective of the communities experiencing it, the change was severe. Lakes shrank, rivers dried, grazing land turned to sand. The populations that had built their lives in the Saharan grasslands had to go somewhere. The Nile Valley was the logical destination. It was to the east, accessible across terrain that was drying but had not yet become impassable desert, and it offered what the shrinking Sahara no longer could: reliable water and productive land. The hypothesis that is seriously discussed in archaeological and historical circles is that the population movement triggered by Saharan desiccation contributed to the demographic and cultural foundations of early Egyptian civilization. If that hypothesis is correct, and it is a hypothesis rather than an established conclusion, then the Edfu narrative of a people who came from the West, whose homeland was lost to catastrophe, and who brought their knowledge to Egypt and established its foundational traditions, might be exactly what it claims to be: a memory, a long-preserved, gradually formalized, eventually mythologized memory of a real migration event. This is not a fringe proposal. The African humid period is established science. The population movement hypothesis is taken seriously by researchers working on North African prehistory. What has not been established is the direct link between that movement and the specific traditions recorded in the Edfu texts and the Shemsu-Hor references in the older sources. The other explanation, before concluding that the Shemsu-Hor represent a genuine historical memory, the alternative explanation that mainstream Egyptology offers deserves a fair hearing, because it is not a weak argument. Egyptian kingship was built on a concept called ma'at. Ma'at is usually translated as truth or justice or cosmic order, but its practical function in Egyptian culture was more specific than any of those translations suggests. Ma'at was the principle that the world should be as it was meant to be, organized according to the pattern established at the beginning of things. The pharaoh's primary function was to maintain Ma'at against the forces of chaos and disorder. The political implication of this framework is significant. A pharaoh who could trace his authority back to the divine order of the beginning of time had a stronger claim to legitimate rule than a pharaoh who could only trace it back to his own father. The further back the chain of authority extended, the more secure the present ruler's position. The Shemsu-Hor, under this analysis, are ideological architecture. They are the mechanism by which the chain of legitimate authority was extended as far back as possible, past the historical dynasties, through a semi-divine category, to the gods themselves. The consistent appearance of the Shemsu-Hor across 4 sources spanning 2,500 years reflects not a persistent historical memory, but a persistent political need. The need for legitimate authority does not change between the 5th dynasty and the Ptolemaic period, so the framework that serves that need does not change either. This is a coherent and well-supported explanation. It accounts for the consistency of the sources without requiring anything to have existed that we cannot find physical evidence for. It fits what we know about how Egyptian political ideology worked. Scholars who work professionally with these texts favor this explanation, and their reasons for doing so are not arbitrary. Both explanations account for the evidence. Neither can be ruled out on the basis of what the texts alone contain. The sudden leap, the civilization that produced the pyramid texts, the Palermo stone, and eventually the Turin king list did not emerge slowly and gradually from the Neolithic cultures that preceded it in the Nile Valley. The emergence of dynastic Egypt is, by historical standards, remarkably fast. The Naqada culture, which preceded dynastic Egypt in the archaeological record, shows genuine gradual development over several centuries. There is real evidence of increasing social complexity, growing trade networks, developing artistic traditions, and expanding settlement patterns. This is the kind of development that archaeology can track and that fits the standard model of cultural evolution. Then, over a period that the archaeological record places at roughly a few centuries, something accelerated. The writing system that appears in the early dynastic period is already complex enough to handle administrative and religious functions at a sophisticated level. The monumental architecture of the early Old Kingdom does not begin with modest structures and slowly work up to pyramids. The Great Pyramid at Giza represents a level of engineering precision that was not surpassed in the ancient world and has not been fully replicated with modern methods. The mainstream explanation for this acceleration is that the archaeological record is incomplete. Sites have not been fully excavated. Evidence has been lost to time, flood, and the destruction of later construction. The developmental stages that would show a gradual progression from Naqada culture to Old Kingdom Egypt may simply be missing from what we have found so far, rather than missing from what actually happened. This is a reasonable explanation, and it may be correct. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly in a region where the archaeological record has significant gaps. What remains true is that the gap between what the Naqada culture shows us and what the early Old Kingdom shows us is larger and faster than analogous transitions in other parts of the ancient world. That observation does not prove anything. It identifies something worth noting. Zeptepi, the idea that connects the Shamsu-Hor to the wider structure of Egyptian belief, is called Zeptepi, a phrase usually translated as the first time or the first occasion. In Egyptian thought, this was the original moment of creation, when the gods brought order out of chaos and established the patterns that would guide the world forever. Everything that existed afterward was believed to reflect that first perfect beginning. It was the foundation on which Egyptian religion, kingship, and society were built. Zeptepi was far more than a symbolic religious idea. It shaped everyday political and ceremonial life throughout ancient Egypt. When a new temple was built, its design, orientation, and sacred rituals were considered valid because they followed the pattern believed to have been established during the first time. Every important ceremony looked back to that original moment. A pharaoh's authority was also justified through Zeptepi. The king ruled not because he created a new order, but because he preserved the divine order that had existed since creation. Even funerary practices were connected to this belief. The rituals performed for the dead were meant to restore them to the sacred state established during the first time, allowing them to enter the eternal order created by the gods. Within this framework, the Shamsu-Hor occupied a unique position. According to the traditional king lists, they ruled during the period closest to Zeptepi. They stood between the age of the gods and the beginning of recorded human history. Rather than being remembered simply as ancient kings, they served as the bridge that carried the authority, knowledge, and sacred traditions of the first time into the historical dynasties that followed. Their role was to preserve continuity between the divine past and the human present. This helps explain why the Shamsu-Hor appears so consistently across different Egyptian sources, including the pyramid texts, the Palermo stone, the Turin king list, and the Edfu building texts. These documents were written in different periods, for different audiences, and with different purposes, yet they all assign the Shamsu-Hor essentially the same role. They mark the point where divine origins connect with human rule, whether Egyptian scribes understood them as literal historical rulers or as symbolic guardians of sacred tradition. The function remained unchanged. The Shamsu-Hor represented the transition from the timeless order established at Zeptepi to the dynastic history that Egyptians believed continued that original divine design. For silence, Egyptian record-keeping was among the most thorough in the ancient world. The scribes, who maintained the administrative, religious, and historical records of the dynastic period, were trained in a tradition that placed enormous value on precise documentation. The kings of the historical dynasties are known to us not just as names on a list, but as individuals with documented building projects, military campaigns, trade expeditions, and family members. The archive they left behind is the foundation of our understanding of ancient history. The Shamsu-Hor left nothing of this kind. No tomb has been found. No city associated with their period has been excavated. No individual name from the Shamsu-Hor period has survived in any context outside the lists themselves. No artifact has been attributed to them. No construction has been dated to their reign. This absence does not prove that they did not exist. Egyptian records were lost, destroyed, and buried, and there is genuine debate about how much of the pre-dynastic period remains to be discovered. The absence of archaeological evidence for the Shamsu-Hor is not more remarkable than the limited archaeological record for many periods of ancient human occupation. What makes the absence noteworthy is the contrast with the thoroughness that characterizes the record for the historical dynasties. The same culture that recorded the dimensions of temple sanctuaries, the weight of tribute payments, and the names of the minor officials who supervised building projects recorded the Shamsu-Hor with a reign length and a place in the royal sequence, and nothing else. No names, no individual rulers, no details beyond the collective category and the total duration. That specific combination of precision in one area and silence in another is unusual enough to warrant attention. A tradition preserved across 4 sources and 2,500 years would typically have accumulated at least some additional detail. The silence is not evidence of fabrication. It may be evidence of a tradition so old that the specific details had already been lost by the time the surviving sources were produced. Sources across 2,500 years tell us the pyramid texts, the Palermo stone, the Turin king list, and the Edfu building texts were produced in different centuries, for different purposes, for different audiences, in different formats. The people who carved the pyramid texts into the burial chamber of a 5th dynasty king were not communicating with the Ptolemaic priests who inscribed the Edfu building texts on the walls of Horus's temple 2,000 years later. And yet, across all 4 sources, the same category appears: a group of pre-dynastic rulers associated with divine authority, positioned between the gods and the historical pharaohs, credited with the transmission of the knowledge and legitimacy on which Egyptian civilization claimed to rest. The persistence of this category across that span of time, in that range of sources, is the primary data point that the question rests on. If the Shemsu Hor were purely ideological invention, they were an invention so deeply embedded in the foundational structures of Egyptian thought that no period of the civilization's 4,000-year history ever felt the need to question or revise it. If they were genuine historical memory, the memory was preserved with a consistency that outlasted the empires, dynasties, and foreign conquests that changed almost everything else about Egyptian culture. Both possibilities produce the same observable result: 4 sources, 4 genres, 4 purposes, 1 claim, unchanged for 25 centuries. The Egyptians spent 4,000 years recording their own history in obsessive detail and never explained where these rulers came from or where they vanished to. That question remains open. The silence around it is as old as the claim itself, and neither has been resolved. The Egyptians spent 4,000 years recording their own history in obsessive detail, yet they never explained where these rulers came from or where they vanished to. That question is still open today. If ancient mysteries backed by real sources are your thing, subscribe and stay for the next deep dive.